I walked out of the church hall, down the side steps, and handed the envelope to the old man sitting on the bench by the parking lot. He looked up at me. I nodded. He took it. I turned around and walked back inside like nothing had happened. 30 minutes later, my son-in-law was outside on his knees, begging that man to give it back. Let me back up. I spent 31 years working for a regional freight company out of Columbus, Ohio. Started as a dock loader, retired as operations manager. My wife passed when my daughter was 19, ovarian cancer, fast and merciless, gone in 8 months. After that, it was just the two of us, my daughter and me, and a small house on Fairfield Street with a broken gutter I kept meaning to fix, and never did. My daughter's name is June. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, which I always thought was a gift, right up until she married Lawrence. Lawrence Boyle came into her life when she was 32. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately started calculating what everyone in it was worth to him, not in a dramatic way, just quietly, behind a smile. He sold commercial real estate and did well at it, which, in his mind, meant he had earned the right to have opinions about everything, including me. The first time we met, he shook my hand, looked at my truck, and said, "Nice classic." It was a 2009 Silverado, not a classic, just old. That was Lawrence. June loved him. That was enough for me for a long time. They got married in 2019. Small ceremony. Nice enough. His family was polished and loud. Mine was small and quiet, just me, my brother Philip from Indianapolis, and my daughter's 2 friends from college. Lawrence's mother made a point of telling me 3 times that her son had gone to Ohio State on a full scholarship. I told her that was wonderful. She said it again anyway. After the wedding, I saw my daughter maybe 6 times a year. Holidays, her birthday, occasional Sunday dinners. Lawrence was always there, always pleasant in a way that felt like a performance. He never said anything outright rude to me. He just had a way of making me feel like I was a guest in my own daughter's life, a tolerated one. The Sunday dinners started changing after the son was born. My grandson, little Hayes, named after Lawrence's grandfather, not mine. That was fine. What was not fine was that I slowly stopped being called for those dinners. It went from every few weeks to once a month to, without anyone saying anything official, almost never. I told myself I was reading too much into it. Old men do that. We sit in quiet houses and we read too much into the silences. But then, June's birthday came around, March of last year, and I drove 40 minutes to their house in Dublin with a card and a pot of tulips, because tulips were her mother's favorite, and June had kept that tradition. Lawrence opened the door and told me June was at a spa with her friends, a birthday thing they'd planned. He said it without apology, without an invitation to come in, without even a suggestion that I leave the flowers somewhere they might reach her. I stood on the porch holding a pot of tulips and nodded. "I'll tell her you stopped by," he said, and closed the door. I drove home and sat in my kitchen for a while. That broken gutter was tapping against the fascia board in the wind. I thought about calling June. I didn't. She hadn't called me either. Here is the thing about being 63 and having spent your whole life being useful to people. At some point, you start to understand the difference between being loved and being kept. I had been useful to Lawrence exactly once, when June needed someone to help them move into their first house and he didn't want to pay movers. After that, I became the kind of relative you mention at Thanksgiving and don't call in March. I was not bitter about it. Bitterness is expensive, and I'd already paid too much for things that cost me nothing in return. What I was clear. Clear the way you get when the weather finally breaks after a long winter and you can see the whole yard for the first time in months. I started doing some things quietly. I updated my beneficiary documents with my financial advisor. I had a modest amount saved. 31 years of working, no extravagant habits, a paid-off house. My IRA, my life insurance policy, a small investment account I'd opened in 2004 and mostly left alone. I rerouted everything, not in anger, in clarity. My brother Philip got one portion. A local hospice organization that had cared for my wife got another, and the rest, the largest part, went into a custodial account I set up for Hayes, my grandson, structured so that it would release to him at 25, independent of his parents. I did not tell June. I did not tell Lawrence. I also took something out of my safe deposit box at the credit union on 5th Street. An envelope I had been holding for 22 years. It was addressed in my wife's handwriting to June. My wife had written it during her last month, when she still had her wits but knew she was running out of time. She gave it to me and said, "Give this to her when she needs it. You'll know when." I had never found the right moment. June had grieved hard and long, and every time I thought about giving it to her, it felt like pulling a scab. So it sat in the safe deposit box in its original envelope, my wife's careful cursive on the front, and I waited. When June called me in September to say she and Lawrence were renewing their vows, a 5-year anniversary ceremony, formal, at the same venue as their original wedding, I said I was glad. She told me about the dinner reception afterward, the guest list, the venue. She sounded happy. I was glad she sounded happy. She did not ask me to walk her down anything, or say any words, or do anything in particular. I was on the guest list. Seat 31, I later found out. Round table near the back, by the kitchen doors. The table where you put relatives you're not sure what to do with. I decided I would give her the letter that night. Not because of the seating, not because of Lawrence, or the tulips on the porch, or the years of being managed from a careful distance. I decided because my wife had said I would know when, and sitting in my kitchen the week before the ceremony, I finally knew. June was 37 now. She had a son of her own. She had built a life that was hers, even if the edges of it had slowly pushed me to the margins. She was old enough to read her mother's words and hold them without breaking. I put the letter in a plain white envelope, the kind to buy in a box of 50 at the drugstore. On the outside, I wrote June's name in my own handwriting. I put it inside a small wooden box I had made in my garage. Nothing fancy, just a piece of walnut I'd had since Philip gave me a woodworking set, the Christmas after my wife died, something to do with my hands. I'd never made anything with it until that week. The box had a small latch, no lock, lined it with a piece of felt I cut from an old green vest my wife used to wear around the house. That was the gift. I drove to the venue on a Saturday evening in September, parked in the back lot, wore the good gray suit I'd bought for my daughter's first wedding, and had dry cleaned twice since. I found my table by the kitchen doors. I set the wooden box beside my plate and I waited. The ceremony was held in the garden section. Lawrence cried, which surprised me. Maybe I had underestimated him. Maybe the tears were real. June looked beautiful. She always looks like her mother when she's happy. It's something in the way she holds her chin up. At the reception dinner, I was seated with Lawrence's uncle from Akron, a couple who appeared to be neighbors of theirs, and 2 women I didn't recognize who spent most of dinner talking to each other about a renovation project. Nobody introduced themselves to me. I introduced myself to them. The uncle from Akron shook my hand, and then immediately turned back to his phone. The meal was served. I ate the salad. The entree was a dry chicken with a sauce that tasted like it had been made from a packet. Then the gifts were opened. This was Lawrence's idea, I later understood. He liked the theater of it. Gifts opened at the table, read aloud, passed around. Some couples do this. It always strikes me as an efficient way to rank your guests by generosity. Lawrence's mother went first, a weekend at a resort in Hocking Hills. Applause. His brother gave them a new stand mixer, the expensive kind. More applause. Friends gave wine subscriptions, experience packages, framed photos, all of it lovely and expected. When it came to my table, Lawrence's uncle handed over a card. Then the neighbors, then the renovation women. Then Lawrence looked at me, pleasant smile, and said, "And from June's father." I handed him the wooden box. He held it up. He turned it over in his hands. He shook it slightly. Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes. "What is this?" he said, not quietly. "It's for June," I said, "from her mother and me." He set it down on the table and slid it toward June without opening it. June reached for it, and Lawrence put his hand briefly on her arm and said, loud enough for our table to hear, "I think we know what's in these kinds of boxes." His mother laughed. Someone else laughed. June did not laugh. She looked at me and then looked at the box. "Open it later," Lawrence said, and he picked up the box and set it with the other gifts on the side table, the dismissal so clean and practiced that half the table had already moved on before I'd processed what happened. I understood. A small wooden box meant something handmade. Handmade meant cheap. Cheap meant the old man by the kitchen doors had not matched the room. I sat for a moment, finished what was left of my coffee, set my napkin on the table. Then I stood up, walked to the gift table, took my wooden box back, carried it out the side door, down the steps, across the parking lot, and handed it to the man sitting on the bench near the lot exit. He was somewhere around my age, maybe older. He had a paper cup of coffee and a worn jacket. He'd been sitting there when I arrived. "Sir," I said, "would you like this?" He looked at the box. He looked at me. He took it. "Thank you," he said. "Take good care of it," I said. I walked back inside. I returned to my seat by the kitchen doors. I poured myself more water from the pitcher on the table, and I sat quietly. I do not know exactly when Lawrence noticed it was gone. 15 minutes, maybe 20. I saw him check the gift table once, twice, a third time. Then he leaned over and said something to June. Then he was moving toward the side door. From my seat I had a partial view of the parking lot through the window. I watched him talk to the man on the bench, watched him gesture at the box, watched the man shake his head slowly, watched Lawrence put his hands together, actually put his hands together the way you do when you're pleading. The man looked down at the box in his hands. Then he stood up, and he walked back into the venue. He walked straight to where June was sitting. He set the box on the table in front of her, and he said, "Your father asked me to hold on to this for a moment. I think it's time you had it." June opened the box. She saw the felt lining. She lifted the envelope. She saw her mother's handwriting and her own name in that careful cursive. She did not speak for a long time. I was watching from across the room. I did not go to her. I let her have it. Lawrence was standing behind her. He was reading over her shoulder. I saw his face change as he realized what the envelope was. Not a check, not a gift card, not anything you could assign a dollar amount to. A letter from a dead woman to her daughter. 22 years in a safe deposit box, given at the right moment, finally. June read it twice. I could tell because I know how she reads. She always goes back to the beginning when something matters. Then she looked up and found me across the room, and she held up the letters slightly. Just a small lift, and I nodded back. She excused herself from the table. She walked to the restroom hallway, and she was in there for about 10 minutes. When she came out, her eyes were red, but she was composed, the way her mother always got composed after the private moments. She walked across the room to me. She pulled the chair next to me out and sat down in it. "How long have you had this?" she said. "Since just before she passed." "Why didn't you give it to me before?" She said I'd know when. I didn't know until now. June looked at her hands. Then she said, "I'm sorry about earlier, about Lawrence. You don't need to apologize for him." "I know. I'm apologizing anyway." We sat there by the kitchen doors for a while. The dinner was winding down around us. Someone was giving a toast at the main table that we could have here but weren't listening to. "What's in the letter?" I asked, because I had never read it. My wife had sealed it herself, and I had kept it sealed. June was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she knew Dad. She knew she wasn't going to see me grow up, and she wrote down all the things she wanted to say. Everything. The things she hoped for me. The things she was afraid of. What she wanted me to know about you. She stopped. She said, you were the most decent man she'd ever known. She said to hold on to that, to not let anyone make me forget it. I looked at the tablecloth. "She was right," June said. "I forgot it for a while. I'm sorry." I did not tell her about the beneficiary changes. That was not for that night. There would be time for practical things later, and they would be handled practically. What mattered that night was the letter, and the felt-lined box on the table, and my daughter sitting in the chair next to me, with her mother's words in her hands. The man from the bench had gone. I saw his paper cup still on the bench outside when I finally left. The parking lot was quiet. The September air was cool and smelled faintly of the river that ran behind the venue property. I sat in my truck for a moment before starting it. My wife used to say that the things you do without an audience are the things that define you. She was a schoolteacher, very literal about lessons. She meant it simply. Be decent when no one is watching, because eventually the watching takes care of itself. I hadn't planned to give the box to the man on the bench as a statement. I did it because I was not going to stand in that room another minute, holding something precious, while people who had never earned the right to judge me laughed at the way I wrapped it. That's all. Simple as that. But the man came back in. He didn't have to. He heard enough to understand, and he came back in, and he walked the box to my daughter himself. And that part I could not have planned. That part was just a decent human being deciding to be decent. There are still people like that. I think sometimes we forget. June called me the following Tuesday. She said she wanted to start having dinner again. Just the two of us, without Lawrence, at least sometimes. She said Hayes had been asking about me. She said she'd been thinking about a lot of things since Saturday, and she wasn't ready to talk about all of it yet, but she wanted me to know she was thinking. I told her that was enough for me. It was. The gutter on Fairfield Street I finally fixed in October. Took me a Saturday morning, and it turned out to be easier than I'd been telling myself for 15 years. That happens with a lot of things, I found. You put them off so long that the fixing of them feels enormous, and then you do it and realize the only thing that was ever hard about it was the waiting. My wife knew when to wait and when to act. She knew the difference. I'm still learning it, but I think I'm getting closer. The man on the bench didn't have to stand up. That's the part I keep coming back to. He heard enough. A daughter, a letter, a mother who had been gone 22 years, and he made a choice that nobody asked him to make. He walked back into that reception hall in his worn jacket and his paper cup of coffee, and he placed that walnut box in front of my daughter like it was the most natural thing in the world. No drama, no speech, just a quiet human being doing the decent thing because it was the decent thing to do. I think about the chain of events that had to unfold for that moment to happen. Lawrence had to dismiss the gift publicly. I had to choose not to argue. I had to walk outside and find exactly the right person sitting on exactly the right bench, and that person had to be the kind of man who still believed that honesty was worth a little inconvenience. Every action produced the next one, not by magic, not by luck, by character. Lawrence's character produced his reaction to a plain wooden box, the quick calculation, the dismissal, the performance for the table. He had spent years making those small calculations, and they had become so automatic he didn't even know he was doing it anymore. That's what happens when you let that kind of thinking run unchecked. It doesn't stay contained to the big moments. It bleeds into everything, into how you open a door for your father-in-law, into how you seat a man at a table by the kitchen, into how you hold your wife's arm when she reaches for something that was meant for her. My character produced my reaction, not silence out of weakness, but silence out of understanding that some things don't need an audience to be true. My wife's letter was true whether Lawrence acknowledged it or not. My love for my daughter was true whether I was seated at table 31 or at the head of the room. The worth of something is not determined by the people who failed to recognize it. That understanding didn't come easy. I spent a long time in that house on Fairfield Street wondering if I had misread things, if I was being too sensitive, if a man my age was supposed to simply accept the distance and call it normal. It takes a particular kind of stubbornness, the quiet, patient kind, to hold on to your own sense of what is right when the people around you keep implying otherwise. Not stubbornness like a wall. Stubbornness like a root, something that holds even when the ground above it looks completely empty. June read that letter, and she found her mother's words, and somewhere in those words she found her way back to something she had drifted from. That's what real intelligence looks like to me, not credentials, not income, not the ability to impress a room. It's the capacity to recognize when you have been wrong and to choose differently. June did that. She sat down in that chair next to me by the kitchen doors, and she said she was sorry, and she meant it, and that took more courage than anything else that happened that night. I fixed the gutter in October. I should have done it 15 years ago, but I did it when I was ready, and it held through the whole winter without a problem. Some things just need you to finally decide they're worth your attention.